Hello and welcome. My name is Florian von Gierke and I want to welcome you to our elfnullelf-studio in Berlin. Today, Germany's incidency rate hit nearly 337 with over 65,000 new infections recorded yesterday. As a reminder, on September 26th, when Germany went to the polls, we were sitting at around 61, 62 and had approximately 3,000 new infections per day. Let's see how things look a month or two from now. Since then, we are also wondering how Germany will be governed going forward. Well, we all assume that it will be the so-called traffic light coalition made up of Social Democrats, Free Democrats and Greens. But it does remain to be seen what these parties will end up focusing on. So far, they have kept things surprisingly under wraps. However, time clearly has not stopped. We are quickly approaching the new year, and with that, the French EU Council Presidency. It won't be a usual presidency, not just because whoever will be Chancellor in Germany will either be on her way out, if it is Merkel, or on his way in, if it is Scholz, but also because Emmanuel Macron will face presidential elections in April. Given this special situation, I'm really excited to welcome our two guests. I will introduce them, but I say welcome at this point to Mr. Barthle and Mr. Manière. So then, let's have a quick look at our agenda for the next hour or so. In just a moment, I will be joined by my colleague Helena Ballreich, who will provide an overview of the election, what has happened since. We will then bring in our guests who will provide their insights on the election and their thoughts on the French presidency. Lastly, there should be a couple of minutes for questions to our guests. Should you have any questions, please feel free to submit them via the Zoom question and answer function. I won't promise to ask every single question, but we will do our best to accommodate as many questions as possible. With that said, I want to bring in my colleague Helena Ballreich. Helena is a consultant with us here at elfnullelf and will kick things off with a look back at the election and look ahead at what might still be coming. Helena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. The Social Democrats narrowly won the vote with only 1.6% to the Conservatives. And I think it's not a secret when I say that 1 year ago, nobody expected that the SPD would have such good results. Compared to the last election in 2017, the SPD gained 5 points. This means that Olaf Scholz, the SPD's candidate, and Germany's current finance minister, is in the pole position to be the next German head of government. With 24%, the most successful party in the history of the German Bundestag had its worst showing in its 7-decade existence. After 16 years, Angela Merkel's Conservatives will most likely to get used to not leading the federal government. With 14.8%, the Greens almost doubled their result from last time. In doing so, they made more gains than any other party. Annalena Baerbock, at 40 years, the youngest candidate, also convinced 250,000 previous non-voters to give her their votes. The FDP, Germany's Liberal Party, improved slightly compared to the last election and is stable at 11 to 12%. They focused on digitalization and innovation and were able to gather the highest proportion of first-time voters. The far-right, Alternative für Deutschland, entered the Bundestag for the second time, having won 10.3% of the vote. But at least I think this is a good thing. In the new government, they also lost their position as the main opposition party. The left wing, Die Linke, failed to reach the 5% hurdle. In Germany, 5% of the are required to earn a place in parliament. But thanks to enough direct mandates, they managed to gain some seats in the Bundestag. How can the new parliament be characterized? At the end of October, the first session of the Bundestag's 20th legislative period began with the traditional gong. And one thing was extremely obvious. It is the largest, diverse parliament in German history. On average, the 736 members of the new Bundestag are significantly younger than their predecessors. The youngest of all is 23 years old and the member of the Green Party, Emilia Fester. In total, 47 members of parliament are younger than 30. However, the typical member of the new Bundestag is 47 years old, male, a trained lawyer, and he is called Michael, as this is the most common first name in the Bundestag. Next to me you can see all the Michaels in parliament. We better not talk about gender diversity. The number of women in the Bundestag is up by 4%, in total 35%, but it is a painfully slow progress towards real parity. However, a small sensation: for the first time, 2 transgender women were elected to Germany's Bundestag. 83 MPs have their roots in migrant communities. That is especially true for the Left Party and the Social Democrats. With regard to the pandemic, the corona crisis reminded us how important the health sector is. However, in the German parliament, health professionals remain seriously underrepresented. They are just a handful of doctors and other healthcare professionals. The majority of MPs are academics. 87% have a university education. So much for diversity. Coming to the ongoing formation of the new government. The road to a new governing coalition is relatively clear. As Florian already mentioned, the Social Democrats, the Greens and the Free Democrats are in the middle of coalition talks to form a so-called traffic light. It seems to be in the realm of possibility that we have a new government before Christmas. But we have heard from the halls of the Bundestag is that the traffic light parties show in this respect much more discipline than the other coalition partners. In 2017, some of you might remember, it almost took 6 months to form a government. The greatest potential for disagreement lies in the areas of climate and fiscal policy, and in how to balance both. I give you some examples on the sticking points between the 3 parties. Looking at climate protection, it is not so much about the target itself, which is carbon neutrality by 2030. It is more about the means. Which path is Germany to take? The Greens want to implement concrete guidelines or restrictions for the economy. Classically, the Liberals want less regulation. They see carbon trading as the primary and most effective instrument to incentivize the economy to limit its emissions. Thus, they want to establish EU-wide emissions trading across all sectors, including heat and transport. Talking about transport, another issue is the mobility sector. One unanswered question is, will the coalition partners agree on a concrete ending of fossil fuel cars? During the World Climate Conference last week, Germany did not sign the agreement on the phase-out by 2040 because they do not want to prohibit combustion engine cars using green e-fuels. Then there is the point where fiscal and climate policy intersect. The Greens want to invest 50 billion euros per year in climate protection projects. But how is that to be financed? The Free Democrats want to comply with the so-called debt brake and are against raising taxes. Already published papers indicate that the FDP could prevail on this matter. However, other climate issues seem already to be decided. 3 parties want to end coal in Germany ideally by 2030, 8 years earlier than planned. Not implementing a speed limit on highways is something the Free Democrats campaigned on, but the Greens strongly opposed. But in the end, the Free Democrats appear to have prevailed. To understand what happens next in the coalition process and how the last sticking points will be solved, let's have a look on the timeline. Last week, all 22 topic-based working groups handed in their negotiation papers. As mentioned before, many unagreed points are still included. It is now the job of the general secretaries and negotiation leaders to turn these papers into a coalition agreement and to clarify the last points of contention. The election of the new Chancellor is scheduled for the week of the 6th December. This means that the coalition contract needs to be ready by November 22nd, which is next week. Why? Because the Greens want to initiate a membership vote on the contract. For the process, they set a time frame for at least 2 weeks. SPD and FDP will vote on the coalition paper and during their party congresses in the first week of December. So what is in store for Europe now? One might say that Brussels and especially France were concerned that a long standoff in Berlin could put a strain on the French EU Council Presidency. The French presidency begins in January next year, and the presidential election in France are coming up in April. For President Emmanuel Macron, this is only a short window to launch EU initiatives before his own election campaign. That makes it all the more important to have Germany as a reliable partner who has his back. the relatively fast coalition-building process could let France breathe a little easier. Germany has long held a certain weight in European policy-making. Angela Merkel helped to lead the European response to the global financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, the migration crisis, and more recently, the COVID crisis. Besides common COVID relief programs with Olaf Scholz as Germany's upcoming Chancellor, we see main intersections with France regarding greater flexibility in monetary and financial issues. One of the main projects at the Eurozone level is completing the so-called banking union, which transfers powers from national to European-wide institutions. Existent about that. That is because many Germans fear that they could be forced to pay heavy bills to support less financially conservative Euro nations. Olaf Scholz once remarked that even although he may be more sympathetic to European integration, he's still the finance minister of Germany. What he means is that no German leader can hand over taxpayers' cash for European projects unless it's definitely in Germany's interest to do so. The most pressing is obviously the green transition. Germany under Merkel has always rhetorically supported EU climate policies. But at the same time, the conservatives have always defended Germany's energy-intensive industries and the huge automobile sector. In other words, Merkel's government has been quite ambiguous when it came to concrete policy choices. This is now likely to change. If the Greens are part of the new government, the German position on concrete measures to achieve the EU's climate targets should certainly become more cohesive and ambitious. In conclusion, we can expect that the German-French teamwork on European matters will be maintained. Olaf Scholz even said during an election broadcast that his first visit abroad would take him to Paris. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Helena. You've certainly given us quite a lot to think and talk about, and I'm sure that your point will be brought in with our guest later on. I now want to bring in our first guest, Norbert Barthle. Mr. Barthle was a member of the German Bundestag from 1998 until just a few days ago, actually, when the new Bundestag came together. He represents there the Backnang-Schwäbisch Gmünd constituency in Baden-Württemberg. He has been a parliamentary state secretary since 2015, first in the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure, and more recently, since 2018, then in the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, Germany's development ministry. Also since 2018, he's Chancellor Merkel's representative for the German Greek Assembly. Before being appointed a parliamentary state secretary in 2015, Mr. Barthle was the CDU-CSU parliamentary group spokesperson on budgetary policy from 2009 on. Mr. Barthle announced that he would not be running for re-election in June of last year, and even though the CDU, as Helena just mentioned, lost quite significantly in these elections, I'm sure he was pleased to hear that his constituency was retained by the CDU. Until just a few days ago, we were unsure if Mr. Barthle would be whisked away to Brussels on official business, so I'm delighted to welcome him from his office in the ministry here in Berlin. Mr. Barthle, welcome. It is great to have you with us.
So thank you very much for this friendly introduction, and it's really a pleasure for me to talk to you about the situation, the political situation in Germany. It's not a pleasure, although, for me to talk about the results of the election for my party, for the CDU and for the CSU, because this election was the greatest disaster in our history. It's a really difficult situation for the party because we have lost our chairperson Angela Merkel after 16 years. In 60 years we had a government with Angela Merkel, and it was a little bit foreseeable that the people in Germany want something new, that there is some kind of mood of change. After 16 years, we had this at the end of Helmut Kohl in the same way, in a similar way. after 16 years of Helmut Kohl government, people wanted something new, and we had a disaster in the election in 1998. And this year, it was a similar situation. Therefore, it's a difficult situation for our party, because we have to find new topics and we have to find new persons as our leaders. It was a long-lasting process in our party since the time Angela Merkel said she is leaving from the chair of our party. Then we had the election between Friedrich Merz and Kramp-Karrenbauer, with a really short result for Kramp-Karrenbauer. And a lot of people who voted for Kramp-Karrenbauer weren't absolutely fans from Kramp-Karrenbauer, but their core motivation was to avoid Friedrich Merz. And this followed in the following years till today in the other following elections between Friedrich Merz and Armin Laschet, and in the decision who is the candidate for Chancellor, Armin Laschet or Markus Söder. And this situation is the most biggest problem for our party, because we have two parts in our party. Some parts, one part are these people who support Friedrich Merz, and the other part is the people who support Armin Laschet. And the new chair of our party that will be elected by the members of our party is the most important thing is to get a new unity in our party, because that's the most important thing for every election. And we have in the upcoming month, we have in 4 or 5 countries in Germany elections. So the time is really short to get a new unity in our party and to get a new chair. And therefore, we are really in the most difficult situation in our history. Nobody thought in front of the last election that the Socialists, the SPD, will be successful in coming up of a level from 13, 14, 50 points in the polls up to the result of now 25% in the election. Nobody thought that it would be possible for Scholz to be the Chancellor. 1 year in front of the election, he said in the television show, "I'm running for Chancellor," and the whole country was amused about this, because nobody thought it will be possible, but it was, and that's really a little bit surprising. And I'm convinced that the 3 parties, the so-called traffic light coalition, will be successful in building a new government in a few days. I don't believe that there is any hurdle that they cannot overcome. So we will get the new government, I think, in the week of 6th December, in the following days. And then we have the situation that this government has to be a reliable government. It's in the interest of whole Europe that Germany and France are the most important countries in the European Union, that they work together closely. And a lot of people in Germany are a little bit worried about the good connection between Monsieur Macron and Mr. Draghi, because they fear, as Helena mentioned, that the policy of the European Central Bank may be that the stability of our currency is not so guaranteed as in the past years, and maybe that we get a union of debt in the interest of the southern parts of the European Union. That's a fear that a lot of people in Germany have, and that's a topic we never discussed in the in the run for the election. We had the wrong topics in front of the election, because we talked in Germany about minimum wage, we talked about pensions, we talked about rental cover, and we talked about social topics in Germany, and we didn't talk about the European policy, we didn't talk about the worldwide policy, and what is the role of Germany in the next 10 or 20 years between China, United States. In all these economic questions were not present, and that's, in my view, the hardest problem for our party, to find the right topics to talk about and to find new topics which are for the future really important. So that's my opinion, that's my view of the things. I hope that the following government will be successful in dealing the huge challenges that we have, that was mentioned with the digital situation, with climate change, but especially in climate change questions, we have to consider that Germany has 2% of coal emissions worldwide. And we cannot do more and faster and spend a lot of money for this and get only little results. Because the decision about the climate will be in China, will be in India, will be in Africa. And if we spend our money there, we get more and bigger and better results with the same money, huge more results than if we spend this money in Germany for being faster and faster for the renewable energies and for going out of coal and from nuclear energy we had decided last years ago. So I think we have great challenges where Germany and France have to work together, and for the G20 and for the G7, there are really big topics to deal with, and I hope the new government will be successful in this. For our BMZ, it's also a difficult situation because we heard from the coalition partners that they are discussing about the idea to integrate our BMZ in the Ministry for External Affairs or in the Ministry for Economic Affairs. It would be a great mistake, in my opinion, to go this way, because our minister, Gerd Müller, was very successful in enhancing our budget. In 2 periods, we doubled our budget from 6 billion euros to 12 billion euros. So we have a budget that is bigger than the Ministry of Justice, bigger than the Ministry of Economic Affairs, bigger than the Ministry for Environmental Affairs. So it would be a great mistake to build down and build back this ministry, and I hope that would not be happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barthle, for those insights. I've already jotted down a couple of them, and I will take the freedom here to say to your last point about integrating the BMZ into other ministries. I've worked with the BMZ for a couple of clients, and I can say that the work that has been done there is quite remarkable, and whatever is being done, there should be a focus there in any case. But I will bring you back in later on when we come to the discussion part. For now, I want to bring in our second guest, Philippe Manière. Mr. Manière is co-founder and president of the French communications agency Vae Solis Communications, where he advises clients ranging from large French and international firms to trade associations. He started his career in journalism at the Quotidien de Paris newspaper, later joined the French weekly magazine Le Point, as a columnist and later became the magazine's chief editor for 10 years. He also was the editor at Expansion. From 2004 to 2009, he became managing director of the Institut Montaigne, a privately funded think tank that was founded by the former AXA CEO, Claude Bébert. Under Mr. Manière's leadership, the Institute significantly expanded and now is one of the leading and most influential French think tanks. He's hosted numerous economic and business shows, including on Radio Classique, Europe 1, BFM Business, and he's frequently invited to comment on business and political news, as he is here today, both in print and in broadcast, including on Arte, LCI, and France Culture, as well as magazines such as L'Express and Challenges. He's also published 7 books, if I'm not mistaken. Mr. Manière is a Knight of the Legion of Honor and a holder of the Academic Palms. He's also the director and executive committee member of Aspen, France. Mr. Manière, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Florian, and thank you for this very generous introduction in all meanings. You didn't need to say all that on me, and I can't tell you whether it was 6 or 7 books, I can't remember, but I will tell you later on. In any case, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight and to be able to discuss with Norbert Barthle. And I'm very happy that you associated me to this event. So again, a great thank you to elfnullelf. You invited me to tell you what were the reaction and expectations of France after the German election. I have to start with a preliminary confession. There is not much interest within the French opinion for the German election, as you can imagine. No people on the world are much interested in elections happening abroad. But in addition, as Helena mentioned, we are kept busy enough by our own election, which is looming. And when I say election, I should actually say elections, because we have the presidential election in April. But just afterwards, in June, there is a general election, and there is much uncertainty about this general election, even if we were told today who will be elected as a president in April. I think that we would not be able to say whether he or she will have a majority at Parliament after the June election. So this, as you can imagine, keeps us busy enough. And then there is another reason why there is a limited interest. It's that the German political landscape actually is not going through any kind of revolution like the one we knew in France, with Macron happening and coming from nowhere, and a major change in French politics that had been dominated by the socialists and the Gaullists for decades. And suddenly, 5 years ago, Macron came. We had already had this rise of Front National, the extreme right party. And so our landscape is very, very disseminated among 4 or 5 parties now. Whereas in Germany, I was interested to see in the chart that Helena just showed us, if you add CDU and SPD, you still have around 50% of the votes, which is quite a lot. Whereas in France, if you add the traditional Gaullists and the traditional socialists, based on the voting intentions today, you get barely to 20%, which is quite frightening. So we had a real revolution in our political landscape. I'm happy for Germany that you did not have any kind of earthquake like that in the last election. So of course it's less exotic and it's less exciting for a foreign observer. Now there is not only of course, I should mention that the French politicians and the French administration is much more interested in the German election and its outcome than the general opinion. That goes without saying. But not only there is not much interest, there is also not much understanding of the way the German politics works when it comes to elections and coalition building. This non-presidential system that you have in Germany, and that actually many countries have, is quite hard to figure out for a French person. As you know, our political life is very much organized around the pivot that the presidential election is. So it's a bit puzzling for a French person to figure out what is at stake now, what is happening now. There is also a kind of almost systematic confusion made by the French observers between what is a parliamentarian system with no autonomous, powerful executive, and on the one hand, and instability. And there is actually in the French reptilian memory of the French, there is this idea that a regime where parties interact and build coalition is by definition doomed to be unstable, which is absolutely inaccurate. When you look at it, it's quite impressive. As you know, Angela Merkel had to deal already with 4 French presidents. And I think that Olaf Scholz himself knew like 5 French Minister of Finance. So when you look at facts, France is not as stable as Germany. But there is this suspicion in the French, in the French, among the French opinion that this bizarre parliamentarian system is not stable, and so it's less interesting to invest in understanding what is happening because there is this suspicion that it will change, which is not the case, by the way, at all, as I was just saying. Plus, it's quite difficult to grasp the process of this long-lasting coalition negotiation that enables a solid agreement within the coalition partners that will need afterwards like a kind of a gospel of a lasting reference for several years, whereas we have a quite different system where tactical party alliances happened, or you have alternatively a single party that holds the majority without any kind of alliance. But in both cases, this power of a coalition or a single party is constantly challenged at parliament by individuals. There is no long-run commitment of anyone to stay together and implement any kind of negotiated program. It's very different. So it makes it all quite difficult for a French person to understand what is happening in Germany. Now, if I come to the expectations of the French, again, not much is expected. I think here, neither within the opinion nor within politicians. First, because these negotiations seem quite technical and a bit dull and boring, and so we don't, as I was saying, grasp very well what is happening. But mainly because the Germans are well known as being pragmatic and have a kind of notoriously limited taste for lendemain qui chante, enchanted tomorrows, which is, as you know, the big thing in France. And so there is nothing in Germany like cutting the work week or a nationalization or privatization, major things at stake when the election comes. Yes, of course, quitting, letting down nuclear power or opening the borders to 1 million immigrants were very bold moves. But when you think of it, they were more or less improvised in reaction to events happening, and they were not something corresponding to any kind of electoral promises. So there is this idea that, this negotiation will end up with a program that is bound to be unambitious in a way. And as you know, the French tend to like what is, ambitious and conceptual, and they don't like very much what is practical. In addition, there is not much hope that Germany may change its vision or policy preferences in many matters. Germans are Germans. They like fiscal orthodoxy. They are trade-driven. They don't like, as I was saying, big ideas. And probably this is all here to stay, whoever the Chancellor ends up being. And finally, Olaf Scholz is not known for being neither a Francophile or a Francophone. So there is no hint that he will have any kind of particular interest in the Franco-German relationship. Even if Helena, I think, mentioned it is already known that he will abide to the tradition of paying his first visit abroad to France, which is nice. Now, in spite of this lack of interest and lack of understanding, lack of expectation, actually, is there a genuine importance for France in these German elections? I would tend to say yes. First, and again, Helena alluded to that already, the French presidency of the EU is looming. It's starting on January the 1st. And I think it's a very questionable decision, but Macron, as you know, made the decision to not ask for a postponement, for postponing the French presidency. As you know, when the rotating presidency happens to entrust the presidency to someone who is submitted to elections, there is a possibility for the state to ask for a postponement of the presidency. And very consciously, Macron did not ask for the postponement. He obviously wants to use this presidency to raise his own profile ahead of the April election. Of course, he wants to showcase as much as possible based on the European election and benefit from the fact that at least for a certain number of months, there will be no other natural leader in Europe that can overshadow him, at least during the first month of Olaf Scholz. Then we'll see. More fundamentally, it's an important period for France, both in terms of pride and capacity to push an agenda. France would, of course, love to have Germany with it to change the EU and possibly the world. You know our lyric tendency. But everyone knows that the good old times of the Franco-German Directorate, good old times for us, but maybe not for the others. In any case, they are gone, and any hope to push this or that based on the simple binational agreement between France or Germany would be deceiving. Sometimes it works. There is some vestigial efficiency in that way of working, but it's certainly no longer what it used to be for that matter. But when you look at the issues that we are Germans, French, Europeans coping with, actually all are more or less connected to this EU or German vision and depend, for that matter, on what is happening on the German landscape. Just let me list a few of them: competitiveness, economical sovereignty, as we name it, economic growth, defense, energy. This is all issues that have a major European component, and so based on that, I think it's interesting to go quickly through a few fears and or hopes that the French could have based on the German election. One is if the German Ministry of Finance is trusted to a liberal from FDP, like Lindner or someone else, there is a serious risk, obviously, that budget orthodoxy remains high in the German agenda, which is seen as bad for France, because, as you know, we are not world champions in terms of fiscal orthodoxy. Conversely, if the Social Democrats can dominate the coalition, and in particular have one of them appointed for this job, which I think is very unlikely, then one could think that budget orthodoxy will be not that high on the German agenda, hence on the EU agenda. Another point is defense. If the coalition is too much under the Greens' influence, then the French idea of pushing the EU defense one step further will probably not prosper very much, to say the least. It might be ruined. And so that is something that obviously is important to the French, and that depends partly on the coalition building process in course. Now, another matter that is important to the French, as you know, is the famous taxonomy. If the Greens are too pushy and make themselves heard too well for France within the coalition, then the French plan, the French idea to have a nuclear power fall on the good side of this famous taxonomy, basically to ensure that climate objectives are attained without depending too much on foreign powers, then this plan will obviously be threatened. And also, if another problem is that if the FDP is powerful, it is less likely to see the EU revise further its competition policy with, let's say, more opening to national or European champions and less of what we tend in France to call obsession with consumers' interest. Obviously, France would like the EU to be more tolerant to champions building, less obsessed with competition, and certainly depending on whether the FDP is powerful or not, might have some influence on the evolution of the EU's position on that field. Same could be said about the trade agreement with Mercosur, obviously. And finally, another point is that if the coalition ends up too favorable to renewable wind and solar, which requires gas because they are intermittent, then Germany will probably be leaning towards Russia more than France is leaning itself, and more than it wants its partner to be leaning. So there is also probably a diplomatic, international, geopolitical dimension in that. So for Macron and his team, obviously, there is much at stake, and there is much uncertainty as long as the new government is not formed and announced, and hence quite a lot of impatience and quite a lot of anxiety. I don't know whether you noticed that Clément Beaune, our Ministry for Foreign Affairs, for European Affairs, visited the three parties likely to form the coalition in October. I've read in the French newspapers, I don't know whether it's accurate, that actually everyone was surprised to see him that early, because the coalition not having held its discussions and not having come up with some kind of agreement. It was probably very early to pay a visit to the three parties. But I've read in the French newspapers again that no one dared telling him that it was useless to come that early, and so he came and visited the three parties. So again, this lack of understanding of the German system is noticeable here. But in any case, there is this anxiety that made him travel mid-October to meet with the three components of the likely coalition, which speaks volumes about the anxiety of the French government. Finally, I think it's fair to say that if you look at the complex issues that just went through, probably a grand coalition or even the Jamaica coalition would have been more favorable to France and more positive to Macron's agenda than this traffic light coalition, where seen from France, it's an inconvenience. Powerful Greens and powerful Liberals might be a threat because they are some of their projects are inamicable to French projects and French vision. On that, I'm happy to take questions when the time comes. And again, thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manière. I must say, it sounds as if France, on the one hand, will have very interesting months ahead, which will then spill over into quite a couple of interesting months for the European Union and by extension for France. I want to bring back in Mr. Barthle to the discussion. And I have a couple of questions which I jotted down, but I want to start off with one which came to me when you mentioned just now all the areas, policy areas where there's going to be problems potentially with the new government. You mentioned energy, you mentioned foreign affairs, and all kinds of other fiscal policy. And I was wondering, and I want to start with Mr. Barthle on this, what do you think are going to be some common visions, common projects that the partners, and I do want to call them partners at the EU level, can actually still push if, as it seems, everything is so difficult right now?
So I think the most important challenge is the transition of our economy. The transition of our economy in the energy sector to find a way to be very fast in finding new renewable resources and find solutions for our chemical industry, for the steel industry, and for the mobility sector. And therefore, I'm convinced that we do need a huge range of Wasserstoff, H2, because the economy and the industry for steel and for chemical will need the H2 in huge ranges, and I think we will be in the situation to import this from Africa or from Australia or from South America, where also it will be produced. And the second challenge, and that will be a great problem for the new coalition, are the immigrants. If we see that in Afghanistan are 2 or 3 million people who are waiting to leave the country, and they are waiting for the chance to leave the country, and if they get this chance, they will come to Europe, and the first land they are visiting is Germany. So the new coalition will have a great challenge to deal this topic, because there is a huge gap between the Greens and the Liberals in this question, and that will be the most interesting question for me, how they can solve this problem in the future.
Mr. Manière.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to say what is happening, but certainly what Norbert was just mentioning on immigrants is making the news currently. As you know, the immigrant candidates don't scream France, France, France. They scream Germany, Germany, Germany. And certainly it's a general principal problem for all of us in the EU, but it's more of a concrete and operational problem for Germany than for the others. Now, honestly, I'm not sure I can tell more.
You just mentioned immigrants. Maybe just on a side note, then the question: what do we do with the situation on the Polish border right now? Because obviously that's not directly the Afghanistan issue that you mentioned, Mr. Barthle. That's, I think, an issue that's also very emotional, because we as the West sort of created the situation there. I think we're in agreement there. But we have a whole different situation with Lukashenko on the eastern border now. Just a quick question there.
I think the situation at the frontier between Poland and Belarus it's an actual problem, but it's only an actual problem. It's not so big. We can deal it and we can find solutions, but it gives us an imagine what will become in the next month, in the next few years, and then we do have another situation. If we are not successful in having a good development policy for Africa, for other countries, lower developed countries in this world, many people will go to Europe, and not only to Germany, to whole Europe, and this will be for us, in my opinion, one of the greatest and biggest challenges for the next few years.
Yeah. If I may, Florian, I think it's very important a problem again in terms of image and principles. As you know, most Europeans were not enthusiastic about Donald Trump, and one of the things that were regularly reproached to Donald Trump was the famous wall on the Mexican border. And what are we doing now? We are building a wall, which I think is in many ways legitimate. No country can tolerate that a neighbor exerts such a blackmail as Lukashenko's blackmail on the EU. But in terms of self-esteem, loyalty to our values, what is happening now on the Polish border will certainly raise many problems over time.
To you, Mr. Barthle, you mentioned also the situation in the beginning of your input with the conservatives, with the CDU right now, with the new party chair. Angela Merkel at one point always said the chancellorship and the party chair should be in one hand, must be united, because otherwise it would create instability there. We saw what happened with the CDU, but actually with the Social Democrats, we're having the same situation now, right? We're having Olaf Scholz, who will probably become Chancellor in a few days, weeks, but he's not going to be party chair. In fact, we don't know who's going to be party chair because one of the two chair positions is up for grabs, though most likely it's going to be Mr. Klingbeil. So I wonder, what is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's, first of all, our party, CDU. I think we will have in January of next year, we will have the new chair. I presume that it will be a short race between Friedrich Merz and Norbert Röttgen. It will be a short race and nobody knows what is the result. And then we have the situation, chair of the party and chair of the Fraktion, of the club in the parliament. And I'm convinced that should be in one person. And the same with the socialists. If they have the chair of the party with two persons, Lars Klingbeil and Saskia Esken, and the Chancellor Olaf Scholz, they will get problems. Because the parliament, if the parliament is in another opinion than the government, you get problems. And you can only work together close with the parliament if these positions are in the same person. Therefore, I'm not I cannot say the socialists what they have to do, but in my opinion, it would be necessary to have it in one person.
Perfect. And looking at France, you have the general election and you also have the presidential election, which will potentially create a similar situation in the sense that the presidency might not have the same party that wins the general election. I'm not going to ask you to look into a glass bowl about who's going to win either of those elections, but maybe you can try to figure out a glass bowl and see what might happen in that regard.
Now, what is interesting, for those of you who are not too familiar with the French political system, for years we had general elections every 5 years and presidential elections every 7 years, which sometimes ended up with what we name cohabitation. You had a majority, the parliament was, let's say, red, but the presidency was blue. And then they had to do, for a short period of time that looked very abnormal from a French perspective, what you guys do constantly, that is, Verhandlung, log rolling, you name it. It was normally something that should have disappeared because the parliamentary elections remained every 5 years, but the presidential term was reduced to 5 years. And then, because it would have no meaning to elect a parliament and then a president, we decided to hold the presidential election and only afterwards the parliamentarian election. But given that the parliamentarian election, general elections are usually like 1 month, 1.5 months after the presidential election, it actually, deprived parliament from any autonomous legitimacy. The parliament depended 100% depends now 100% on the president. Usually the French would deliver the same kind of vote and would ensure that the president has immediately a 5 years majority. But here it's a bit different. It's a bit different because be it Macron or Marine Le Pen, they are the two most credible candidates at that time as we are talking. None of them has the certainty of having a majority because both parties are very poorly implanted in territories. They are powerful on national politics, but they are very weak locally. So none of them can be sure of having a majority. And in addition, for some calendar ridiculous, very trivial contingent reasons, this time the general elections comes a bit later. So the French might change their mind. And finally, if it's Marine Le Pen who wins, again, it's not the most probable, but in terms of odds, she ranks number 2. It's quite likely that the French will try to correct their first vote for her with an alternative majority. So there are a lot of possibilities whereby you would have a president that would, after 2 months, immediately have a parliament that is not in alignment with him or her, and with him, with which he should constantly, interact in a transactional mode. which makes things quite difficult to anticipate in terms of public policies that are likely to be voted and then implemented.
Mm-hmm. Both of you just mentioned in your speeches energy and also the questions then about reforming our industry. And I found it curious because in Germany, under Angela Merkel, Germany went out of nuclear power. In France, Mr. Macron just announced a few days ago that France, I think, would build 6 new nuclear power plants. If both countries are going to work together on energy union and on a common energy policy for the European Union and decarbonizing the European energy system, that seems like quite a big gap. Obviously, nuclear power is CO2 free, but how can those two be united?
If you allow me, if I speak frankly, I'm convinced that we do need nuclear power in the future because we have a lot of countries, they don't have the ability and they don't have the financial power to have the transition from coke, from all these energy solutions away from the carbon. They don't have the possibility to finance the transition. They need nuclear power. And I'm convinced that countries like China, in China we have a little bit more than 1,000 energy systems with coke. In every year, China is building up 100 new energy plants with coke. New. In whole Germany, we have 110 energy systems with coke. So if you see these relations, it's the only solution for these countries who need much more energy in the next years. They do need nuclear power. I don't see any other way. It's my opinion, but it's not the opinion of my party.
Unfortunately, yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic because obviously the Germans and French are very divided for that matter. I mean, they don't share the same vision, which is bizarre because we are both people of engineers. We both have major companies in the energy sectors. It's not something that one of us would not know about. France and Germany are powerhouses for energies. But now I can remember the cover story of Der Spiegel a few years ago. When you saw the windmills, the ailing windmills, with the title Merckx in Germany. Energiewende did not work in terms of its objectives. And as much as I love Germany and the Germans and German language, I just never could figure out how this could happen, that the Germans made such a bad decision. And I think that I'm not talking just for myself. I think that really the majority of the French people and the French politicians, except for the Greens, probably, share my view that it's something that just doesn't fly. You just can't decide to quit the only regular, powerful source of non-carbonated energy at a time where you said that climate is the top priority. It doesn't fly. It's not something that is understandable. But I suspect that this coalition is unlikely to come back to nuclear power. So certainly there will be negotiations. I suppose that it's almost impossible, I think, to prohibit France from using nuclear as much as it wants, because it's a question of logic, of pride, of national industry. But certainly there will be, as Europe is very gifted to come up with bizarre, complex solutions whereby everyone finds what he or she wants to. But it's certainly something where we cannot be reconciliated without some kind of ambiguity by design. We need some ambiguity so that anyone can do what he wants, but pretending we have an agreement.
So we're nearly out of time. I want to ask one quick question, if I may, still sort of in line with what we were just talking about in terms of working together. Both of you mentioned fiscal policy to some extent. we're going to have the situation with the FDP potentially leading the finance ministry. You mentioned that that would probably be a bad scenario for the French, or something they might not like. But I still wonder how that will play out, because it's going to be really important going forward. We're going to see, big reconstruction after COVID going to have to happen. I think in Germany, in terms of employment, we're doing fairly well still, but lots of other countries aren't. So I wonder your thoughts on fiscal cooperation, fiscal union, debt union potentially. Obviously, there's also a debate in Germany between the Social Democrats and the FDP and the Greens, but I wonder your thoughts there. Maybe we start in Paris. Mr. Manière.
Thank you. So very shortly, because I'm not a specialist of the FDP, obviously. I think that it's perceived as bad for the French, because we want to be kept to be left free of doing silly things. But I think it would be good for France that demanding FDP of the German finance ministers is adamant on fiscal orthodoxy. I think that France is really doing poorly without any kind of reason. We have the bad habit of spending too much, and if we have some kind of supervision or permanent vigilance by an SPD German finance minister, I think it would be perceived as bad by the French government, but certainly it would be good for my country.
Thank you.
I think this question is important for the new coalition and important for the relation between France and Germany, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the fiscal stability and the European currency, the EU, is for us very important, and we feel that we get a good connection between Draghi and Macron, and a good connection between the southern parts of Europe and French, and maybe the eastern countries of Europe. So in the last few years, Angela Merkel was the anchor, the point of stabilization and of a serious fiscal policy. And I hope the new coalition under a finance minister from the FDP will play the same role as we played it in the past years.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you for those. I will take them as closing remarks, as we've unfortunately run out of time. I think there's a million and two questions that I've still jotted down and that we could ask, but we promised to our audience that 8 p.m. would be closing, but so unfortunately it's the end for now. To everyone out there, obviously this is a discussion which will continue. The German government hasn't been formed yet, so we will see what happens, and if there's any questions you might have on the new German government, but also on the relationship to France, please do not hesitate to reach out. We'd be more than happy to assist you with that, or any other questions you might have. And with that, I want to close this webinar, and thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.